Irene, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. You're welcome to this virtual workshop. I am called Irene. I am from Uganda. Uganda is in East Africa. We are bordered by Kenya, Tanzania, and I'm from Makerere University Business School. We are hosting this virtual workshop on literature review, and we think we have few scholars within even our region that have written studies using this methodology, and we thought having a workshop in this area will be very useful. We are hosting Professor Meron from University of Macquarie, Sydney, Australia. He's an established scholar in that methodology, and we think he's going to add a lot of value to us in that area. I now take this opportunity to welcome our AAFA President, Professor Stephen, to make his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Irene. I take this opportunity to welcome you, everyone, and thank you for being with us today in order to make this event very fruitful, and indeed, so far, it looks colorful. As you are aware, the theme of today is doing rigorous literature review in accounting and finance research. And this theme identifies with AAFA's broad strategy of enabling African accounting scholars scale up to the global stage. I want to thank you in a special way, Professor Mauricio, for agreeing to speak to us today on this important topic. From this workshop, we are aiming to obtain valuable insights and guidance on how to engage in high-quality accounting research. Particularly, the engagement aims to provide practical guidance on conducting a systematic literature review and meta-analysis in business research, and may address questions such as when and how to appropriately engage with structured and sophisticated literature review methods. The workshop potentially focuses on strategies for publishing high-quality literature review papers. And for this, I want to thank you, Professor Irene Narukenge, our AAFA representative for the East African region, for thinking ahead. Thank you to our AAFA members and executive present for gracing this important workshop. I want to take this opportunity to thank the members who are joining us today for the first time. This is the African Accounting and Finance Association, which joins together all academicians of accounting and finance discipline in the African continent and beyond. Beyond meaning the Africans in diaspora and other accounting researchers who are sympathetic to the African continent. This is what we do. Part of what we do is to have workshops of this nature, but also every year we have an annual conference where we present our work among ourselves, where we have young scholars, those PhD students, and everyone who is interested in being mentored, have their work presented at that conference. It is one of a kind, and it is one you could think that it ranks among these other top conferences that you have had in the world relating to accounting and finance. This year, We will be going to Zimbabwe. The host will be the University of Zimbabwe, and this will be in September, early September. And we are inviting all of you to attend this conference. The call for papers is still open, but also you can still attend even if you don't have a paper to present, because our aim is to inculcate learning among ourselves and also networking among the best scholars in the accounting and finance discipline. As you know, for the past 13 years, AAFA has been undertaking the most deep-rooted transformation in the African accounting history. Now, workshops of this kind is one such important intervention. At this moment, ladies and gentlemen, I also invite you to join us kindly in September 2024 for our annual conference in Zimbabwe. I wish you all a fruitful workshop. Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Nkundabanyanga. Stephen Nkundabanyanga of Makerere University Business School. I'm a professor of accounting and governance. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you so much, Professor Stephen, for the opening remarks. I can attest I've attended those, the annual conference. It is indeed great. You're all invited. I take this opportunity to give you a small bio of Professor Meron before he's invited to present. As I said, Professor Meron is from the University of Macquarie, Sydney, Australia. He has written widely using the literature review method. In fact, when you search about him, his papers on conducting a systematic review and bibliometric analysis is among the highly cited papers, those that use this method. He has also published in highly ranked journals, for example, the European Journal of Information Systems, and he serves on so many editorial boards, and that is the person we are hosting today. He's really going to take us well in this area, and we stand to benefit. He also, what amazed me from his researches, is an interdisciplinary researcher. He has written widely in the areas of accounting, information systems, and education and learning. I think that is something that we should credit him for. He's written widely in different areas. I take this opportunity this time to invite Professor Meron make his presentation. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Irene. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Professor Yinka, as well, for the opportunity and the invitation. Same to Professor Irene and Professor Stephen. Thank you for having me. It is my pleasure to be here and talk to you. Let me share my screen and then we get to it then. I'm hoping that you can see my screen at this point.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Just let me know when you want the polls as well.
Perfect. Okay. So I am really happy to be giving this presentation today. It's one of my favorite topics. It's one of the areas that I've always been very, very passionate about. So it is a pleasure to be here. I know just like you, that there is an important role to be played with systematic literature reviews, and this role of systematic literature reviews is not going to change with time. I think as the volume of research that we're doing is increasing, as the variety, as the interdisciplinarity of research continues to grow, I think these papers are going to continue to be essential to assess what's happening in the state of the art of research. So in my presentation, in my introduction, we talked about Macquarie University, which is in Sydney, Australia. So I thought it would be a good idea, if possible, to share with you a little video so that you get to know what Macquarie is about, how it looks like, in case you want to visit. Here's a little video. I'll stop it there. The video is too long. But that really helps introduce Macquarie University, the university that I'm at. As the introduction was going on, I sit in the Department of Actuarial Studies and Business Analytics, and I used to sit in the Department of Accounting. So I do understand how you publish in the accounting sphere, but also how you go beyond it. And that's something that you'll notice when I talk to you. I'm not going to give you only the how do you publish in the accounting journals, and as you said, the top accounting journals, but also going beyond that. And I think that there's so much value in doing things like that, in trying to understand how different disciplines approach the idea of a literature review and trying to get those best practices. So when when I'm talking and referring to some of the publications, you'll see that they're coming from many disciplines. As Professor Irene was saying, I've published a publication called Conducting Systematic Literature Reviews and Bibliometric Analysis. That was published in the Australian Management Journal, and that has right now just about 1,000 citations, and it was published in 2020. If you find, say, for example, after this presentation, if you find that you want to read more about this, that's the starting point. That's a good paper to look at. I have published a number of papers, and they're not all listed here. I've published a number of papers in using literature reviews. I believe kind of like one of the first ones that I did was on smart cities, and it was a review and analysis of stakeholders' literature. To me, this is a really interesting paper because rather than just looking at the academic literature, we went and looked at what practitioners were saying about smart cities, what the public was listening, was talking about smart cities, and what the governments were talking about with regards to smart cities. And so by doing a literature review on those four stakeholders, we were able to produce a nice little paper here. I think it's also been cited about 100 times. With James Hazelton of Macquarie University, we published a paper on military accountancy research. And what this paper is about, it's very simple. We saw that when people talked about digital disruption and digital transformation, they use these words synonymously. And so this is a review of trying to distill these two ideas and set clear for future researchers in accounting how these two terms vary. So it's a clarification. The following paper, which was published in the Accounting, Auditing, and Accountability Journal, was titled Trends in Environmental Accounting Research Within and Outside the Accounting Discipline. Very simple. This paper tries to look at the term environmental accounting, which normally appears in accounting journals. But what I noticed when I was doing an initial search is that actually other journals were actually talking also about environmental accounting. The idea of this paper was to understand how the two areas had evolved and try to understand if there were topics of similarity and topics that were perhaps spoken a little bit more in outside the accounting discipline, perhaps research that then could be adopted by our accounting researchers. More recently, I've published a paper on a multi-level review of artificial intelligence in organizations, and one that is very interesting right now, and I think it's, every time I talk about literature reviews, then immediately people start telling me or asking me, well, what about this ChatGPT thing, right? And it's very hot in something that's been spoken about a lot. So I've written this paper. This is a conference paper on how can generative AI help with regards to literature reviews. This was recently published in a conference, and we're trying to get it now into a journal. As was being said, I am in the editorial boards of two of these outlets. I'm in the editorial board of the Australian Journal of Management. I am in the reviewer board of the Accounting, Auditing, and Accountability Journal, and a couple of others. So when I talk about literature reviews, I'm going to give you different perspectives. I have experience being an author, and you've just seen that. I very often get asked to be a reviewer of papers, but I'm also right now a special editor, a special issue editor for QRAM, the QRAM journal, and AAAJ, and I've previously done it for Meditari. Also, I am a PhD supervisor. So my insights and the stories that I'm going to bring you today are coming from those four lenses. So not only one. If you feel that you want to read more about this idea of literature reviews, then I've got a couple of papers that I can recommend to you. Of course, the paper that I've written with Professor Linnenlucke. The second paper that I'm recommending is from Aguinis, which is on the best practices for doing literature reviews. I think that's slightly interesting. A very also good publication is from my colleague at Macquarie University, Professor Dumay, and James Guthrie, who are both at Macquarie. and they've collaborated with an Italian colleague called also Mauricio Massaro. Sorry. And the journal publication is called On the Shoulders of Giants and Undertaking a Structured Literature Review in Accounting. As I said, we have one publication here from management up to now, one on methods, one from accounting, and then the last one is also on information systems. So what I've done is I've gotten the ideas of these 4 different papers, and this presentation is about amalgamating all their best practices into one presentation. And the way I've tried structuring this presentation is to say, what are the main sections of a literature review? And then we look at what are some actionable things that you can do? And then after that, what I will tell you is, what are some examples that how have I encountered this in my research? So before I go on and talk for another, say, for example, hour on this topic, I was wondering what you wanted to get out of this. So I wanted you to, if you could help me fill out a survey or a little poll while we're talking here. Let's see. There we go. So what do you want to get out of this survey? You've probably just seen that question pop up, and I'd love to see what you answer. Is it to improve your literature review skills? Is it more to learn about what are some of the best practices? Perhaps you're right now trying to do a research project and you want to use it pretty much now. Perhaps you're thinking more of a dissertation or a thesis, or maybe you just want to say, okay, what's happening in this area? Or perhaps what you want to do is you want to publish this paper. Ultimately, is it more about networking and getting, seeing people today here? I'll give you a couple of seconds.
Yeah, people are still responding. It's going well.
No problem. I'll get a sip of water then. Thank you to the 87 people that have come. I've just lost one.
Yeah, it could be
the poll. The poll. I tell you, people are getting scared from the poll already. They're like, participation. There's no right or wrong answer, by the way. Now I've noticed that when the video was playing, there was no sound. Too late. It's okay. I just saw the messages. The messages don't pop up as good as they should on Zoom. Okay.
All right, so you've got about 72%.
Okay, let's see. What do people want from this?
About 75% already. Do you want me to end the poll or continue?
Yeah, end it. Let's end it.
Okay.
I know I'm competing with lunch soon.
Okay. I just do this. So
very good.
Can you see the result now?
Yes, I can. So what I am noticing is that 38 want to improve their literature review skills. Then about 8% is looking at best practice. Okay. We have 19% is looking to prepare their dissertation. 22, which is the second highest, I believe, let me see, is they want to publish. So 38 is, the number one answer that I'm seeing is to improve my literature review skills. And 22% is thinking about getting this published. So that's very good, because that gives me an idea about what people are interested in. So I thank you for doing that survey. Now let me go back to sharing my screen. And so for simplicity, I'm going to say that if you can, if you have a question, please send it in the chat and I'll address them in the Q&A section later. I promise that I've left plenty of time to discuss that. And so we can always revisit the questions later. So the agenda for today is exploring what are the objectives of literature review. What is it that we're trying to achieve with literature reviews? Then the second thing that I think it is essential to look at is the different types of reviews. Because often we think of just the one type of review and we say, well, it's either narrative or traditional versus the systematic. And we have to understand that there's a wider range of different types of literature reviews. Then I will go through each stage, each of the main steps of a literature review, from formulating the problem, searching the literature, screening for inclusion, extracting data, data analysis and synthesis, reporting and visualizing, and then the Q&A section. So when we think about the objectives of a literature review, of course, it is to gather existing knowledge and then examine the state of the field. Of course, it is also to advance theory and practice. It will help highlight unresolved issues and formulate new research questions. It will help identify gaps and suggest, as I was saying, future areas of research. And in some cases, it will provide the basis for developing new theoretical models and hypotheses. That is the objective of a literature review. We often just think of this idea of the systematic and the narrative or the traditional. And when we talk about systematic, it's just a replicable process. It follows a detailed, transparent methodology to minimize bias, and it is normally very structured. It is usually a little bit more comprehensive in its coverage because it will list where it was looking for the literature. So it's a systematic way of looking for published, in some cases, even unpublished studies. And it will create a sort of an audit trail, a guide that will allow any other researcher to look and see what decisions were made, what was included, what was decided to not be included. So that ensures that transparency and replicability. However, right, there is a long list of reviews. And let me tell you a couple of different types that we would find. And I think this is kind of like the takeaway number one. Actually, I'll talk about that in the next slide. But there's different reviews that we're going to find in accounting, in management, in information systems. Right? We don't have to always call it a systematic literature review and stop there. So we can think of the type of review that's called a critical literature review, and I think a lot of people think of systematic literature reviews as them having to be critical. So it analyzes the existing literature and tries to reveal weaknesses, contradictions, controversies, inconsistencies. It doesn't necessarily try to pit all research against each other. It just has a criterion and then finds it, it sees if it's acceptable or not. The literature review that's much harder to publish is the narrative, where it's not trying to seek generalization or trying to understand everything that has been done. It is more on literature and evidence that is readily available, and it doesn't provide explanations of how the papers were retrieved. Right? Then there is the descriptive. So in the case of descriptive, and this is something again that we want to try to avoid in literature reviews, it is going to look at papers and end at a point where we're just counting. We're counting the number of papers, of authors, of methods, and that's about it. And that's problematic. I think that, if you get those papers that are descriptive, you need to take them to the next step. So you cannot have papers nowadays in the top journals where you are ending in this descriptive or in this narrative of, you had author A did this, author B did that, author C did that. That doesn't lead to a publishable paper, neither with the descriptive. So then there are a couple of more. We have the qualitative systematic review. This is going to look direction of effect, size of effect, effect consistencies, strength of evidence, and it's different from a meta-analysis. It uses more narrative and more subjective rather than statistical methods to summarize the findings. Sometimes it wishes to use something like a voting mechanism to say, okay, we see support X out of Y times for something. One that's very hot right now, a literature review type that's very hot, very popular right now, is scoping reviews. These are when there's an emerging area. It examines the extent, the range, and the nature of research. What the scoping review is and what it isn't is a little bit unclear. In some situations, it says that you do a review and then you talk to practitioners about this review. Sometimes when people talk about scoping reviews, it's not particularly including, say, for example, going and talking to practitioners, for example. Again, this is, slightly shallow. So it focuses on the breadth rather than on depth. Meta-analysis, meta-analytic techniques, then are going to focus on quantitative data. And then they want to estimate the effect size and understand variability about particular methodological techniques. And finally, you've got the umbrella type. And you have perhaps many literature reviews done on one, and this is the review of the review. You're going to get like all of these reviews, and you're going to integrate them into one umbrella, mega literature review, right? You're trying to understand how different people have approached their literature reviews, and then kind of like combine it into one. And if we were to see how often these types of literature reviews appeared in management journals, this is just to give you an idea, right? Critical reviews, if we looked at management publication, critical reviews appear about 40% of the time, narrative reviews 24% of the time, descriptive reviews 22% of the time, and we go down the list from there. So what are we noticing? Not all reviews are equal. There's some that are just more popular than others. And what we can easily notice is that there's a scarcity in, say, for example, umbrella reviews and scoping reviews. Often we get discouraged as authors when we see that there's already been a number of reviews in the topic that we're interested in. That does not preclude the idea of a publication of another literature review, but in this case, we call it an umbrella review. However, this is not the only, these that I've shown you, they're not the only types of literature reviews. And I apologize for this figure being, perhaps a little bit too small, right? But what we can notice is that there are a large number of different literature reviews. Some of them appear often in our journals, right? But there's a large number of them that often do not appear. There is rapid reviews, for example, which are often not appearing. So there is the opportunity to learn a little bit about these reviews and try to see if these can be applied to management and accounting and finance as well. We don't have to do that much. I mean, if we say, for example, if we say we're going to do a scoping review, 4% of publications are of literature review publications are on that. That already is setting your literature review apart. Okay, so let me tell you about kind of like 2 insights that I think that I've gained when looking into the different types of literature reviews. We see that there's a large number of them. So my first recommendation for you is when you're writing these literature reviews, that 22% of you that's thinking about a publication, think about what type of literature review you want to write and label it when you're writing that. The more infrequent a review type is, the more attractive it becomes to the editors and to the reviewers. And this is something that I'm going to talk about a couple of times, that you know, where you have competition and where you don't have competition, and where you don't have competition, perhaps that's where you should be headed to. So let's get started with the steps of a literature review. And in information systems, we have these steps, these 6 steps on how you do a literature review. So everything from formulating the problem to analyzing and synthesizing data. Unfortunately, a lot of these reviews, so those papers that I shared with you, right? They're really interesting papers because the magic of how you write a literature review is never spoken really about. And I think the magic happens in 2 areas. And you will see often that these are the least spoken about areas when it comes to literature reviews. And I think area number 1 is formulating the problem. And area number 2 is analyzing and synthesizing the data. So what I found is that if I look at those 4 papers, and this was not only the 4 papers that I've looked at, right, I've read before. If you look at those 4 papers, they often tell you the minimal amount of what you could be doing in those areas, but they're not really prescriptive about the how. So in step 1, it's all about defining the objective, providing clear definitions of the key concepts, and very importantly, justify the need for your review article. That one, I think I've, in this presentation, given you a lot to think about so that you're going to be able to do that well. The rest is fairly simple. You know, it's about searching the literature. You know, where are you going to be looking for sources that are pertinent? Then it's about screening what gets included, what doesn't. Then it's assessing quality. Assessing quality is interesting because it's only mentioned in this, sorry, it's only mentioned in this publication. In the other publications, it's not spoken enough, but I've got a way to go around that. That's often very accepted. Then it's about extracting data. And then it's about analyzing and synthesizing it, which is about organizing, comparing, collating, summarizing everything so that you create a new contribution. Step 1, formulating the problem. When we look at formulating the problem, it's about having a clear purpose and a well-defined scope, right? what you're going to notice in a second is that I've gone back on reviews that I have been asked to be a reviewer. And often, probably about 40% of the time, I have a comment about what's the purpose? What is it that we're trying to do in this literature review? So this becomes crucial. And the reviews must have a specific problem that they're trying to solve. A lot of people think that a review is just looking at the data and saying, and trying to say what has happened over time. Often, I think that the good publications, the good literature reviews, are actually asking asking to solve a very specific problem. They want to have a conceptual rejuvenation, or explore theoretical tensions. When you're looking at a paper like that, when you're trying to write a paper like that, you're captivating your reader, and that's the important bit. Not only for writing that section on your literature review, for your thesis, say for example, but more importantly, when you're trying to get that paper published. I do go into a lot more detail, so don't worry if you're like, what does that mean? Okay. So the clarity is about, as I was saying, engaging the reader. What you want is that this research question is tied throughout. It's not something that we abandon and we say, here's a research question, and we never talk about it again. It's something that guides every little bit. So when we have a research question and we are, say, for example, including or excluding papers, the question that we talk about is, does it help answer that research question? Then it's about the motivation and the contribution, the purpose of our research. And finally, it's about a compelling rationale. Very important is to talk about the why now. Why should we publish this now? What is happening? What would stop? What would change if this paper gets published? Is it just a review of the literature, or are we going to solve a problem? For me, and you've already began to see it when I talked about my publications. For me, I love confusion. One of those areas that if you see that, say for example, two topics or two terms are used interchangeably, there's a need for that clarification. If you see that there's an incorrect application okay, let me see if I can think of an example really quickly. Imagine that there's a theory that has originated in psychology, but has also been used in accounting. Or say, for example, if we're looking at, say, for example, something that has been originated in information systems and has now been adopted in accounting. What happens is that when the idea is brought into accounting, right, the accountants and the researchers will take it in one direction, right? But this idea continues to evolve in a separate direction, often in the area of, say, for example, information systems or psychology. And I think a literature review can be about trying to see where these two areas have gone, right? It's very interesting when what happens is that information systems, for example, if we're continuing with that example, stops using a theory or an idea, yet it continues to become important in the area of accounting. So that's a rationale for a literature review. Also, when you're framing this, you can talk about the dangers of not having that clarification. So you want to prevent the adoption of incorrect ideas, or you want to ensure that the field reaches or is aware of this separation, or that it reaches a consensus. So a compelling rationale is spotting of a relevant theoretical puzzle. If you think about, say, for example, the Smart Cities paper, the Smart Cities paper was looking at trying to amalgamate. I've got that on the next slide. Just keep that idea for a second. So what are other compelling rationales? I'll go back to the idea of smart cities in a bit. I think it's the next slide, so I'm not going to jump the gun on that one. What are compelling rationales that we often find as well? These that I'm going to give you here, they're classic, and they're harder, much harder to have to publish with these ideas, right? The idea of gap spotting, of saying, well, this has never been done, right? It is not enough as a motivation to say, well, a literature review has not been done in the last 10 years, so there's a need to do one now. That's weak. There's a reason why it hasn't been done in the last 10 years, right? So that's a little bit more complex. That's why you need the puzzle. However, if you are the person that has been publishing on this for the last 10 years, and you become prolific in this, and when people think about topic X in accounting, they think of your name, then yes, it is a lot easier for you to get published in, say, for example, identifying research gaps or synthesis of existing knowledge. That's harder to accomplish, but there is space for that. And also developing theoretical frameworks, right? Identifying and consolidating various theoretical perspectives that perhaps have been used for one topic or issue in accounting. That's a little bit more complex than the other examples that I gave you in part one, but also worth doing. So what I'm summarizing here on these two slides is, when it comes to, say, for example, that theoretical puzzle, I know right now it sounds complex. It doesn't have to be. That is a type of paper that gets published, that calls readers' attentions, that calls editors' attention and reviewers' attention. When it comes to identifying research gaps and synthesizing, that's a lot harder. And often it is done by, say, for example, the big figures in the field. And then we also have, which is a compelling puzzle, consolidating various theoretical perspectives. The other piece of advice that I have for you in this area is that your topic is not in a vacuum. So a lot of people will do, will say, okay, we're going to do a literature review on, say, for example, something like online learning and distraction. When I get that paper as a reviewer, I wonder if you've looked at literature reviews on very similar topics. So something like learning and distraction, right? Or are you just trying to like say that online learning is a construct that has never been seen before and you're ignoring everything else and you're going to start afresh? Say, for example, I think I've got that example on the next slide as well. Let me see. So one of the important things is that I also want you to look at what previous literature reviews have been done and not shy away from them. I'll tell you why, I think, as well. I'll tell you an example here because I don't think I have it on the next slide. When I did the environmental accounting publication in AAAJ, there were about 20 literature reviews.
And at that point, I did not shy away from having probably about 3 or 4 pages looking at all the previous literature reviews that had been done to try to say, and this is the gap that we're going to fill, and this is why it's important, right? A lot of people, when they're doing a literature review, they feel that the other literature reviews are their competitors and they don't want to mention them. My recommendation is mention them. And maybe your paper is going to try to fill in 2 areas that have never been looked at before. And so don't shy away from it. Look at them and say, create a table and say, this publication here, it's a literature review, it tries to cover this, it doesn't do this and that. Perfect. There's the need initially for your paper. And also not thinking that these topics appeared out of the blue, right? If, say, for example, a paper looked at AI and health adoption, we've had papers and literature reviews before on technology and health adoption, for example. And so not saying, wait, previous literature has looked at these concepts, and our literature review is more interested in the, say, for example, in the example that I have here, is more interested in the online learning rather than just the learning. Then, we understand that you've looked at previous literature, that you understand why this gap is so important, especially if you write about it. So what are my actionable recommendations if you're writing a literature review and you're thinking about that purpose and scope, right? You have to have a good research question. I think that very basic, a very start, very initial point type of question is that were listed in Massaro's work. How is the inquiry into topic X developing? What is the focus and critique of topic X, and what is the future of topic X? That's a good start, much more for a synthesis paper, right? But you might want to divide it into where have we been, where are we at, and where are we going, right? And perhaps when you're thinking about that contradiction, you might begin to say, where have we been? Right? And you might say, well, if this contradiction has existed for 10 years, you might divide it into like the first 7 years as where have we been? Where are we now? It can be the last 3 years. And where are we headed to, right? Differentiating these 2 concepts. And after now, we're going to say, well, when we talk about this concept, this is what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to recommend some future avenues of research for these 2 new fields or these now segregated fields. It's about clearly communicating what's your scope. And this comes to something super easy to do, right? Every time you are interested in one concept, you need to define it. You need to have really clear definitions for what each of the concepts that you're interested in. So if, say, for example, you're interested in online education, online learning, you've got to look for a good source or a good definition for that. And my third recommendation is explicitly name the type of review that you will be using. So now I want to shift gears and tell you about kind of like examples from what I've noticed, right? I have a PhD student right now who's trying to submit their work on a theory that has been adopted in 2 conflicting ways. And, that's a good start. Once you start noticing, once you start reading, once you say, wait a second, there are 2 different streams of researchers, right? And you begin to see that there's 2 camps. And these 2 camps, they might be, say, for example, in some occasions, they might be fighting with each other. Sometimes there is an implicit knowledge that these 2 camps do not agree, but it has never been said. And so that is where you can write a literature review to see, perhaps this exists in accounting, but previously this topic was something that was, say, for example, spoken more in management. What you may say is, okay, we notice this difference. We're going to go back to management and see if we can answer the question of which camp is more likely to be right, or where have these camps split off, or does this split also exist in management, right? I have acted as a reviewer of the AI and health paper, which I was talking, and what I asked the author when I got this paper and I was being asked to review was, okay, you're doing a literature review on AI and health. Have you considered looking and summarizing in your literature review, in the introduction of the paper, say, for example, have you considered writing about previous literature reviews on digital and health? To try to understand the concept right now, not saying, okay, this is something completely new, AI is here, nothing compares to it, this is a completely new concept. That's not particularly true. It's about framing that paper. I've already spoken a couple of times about digital disruption and digital transformation. This is the Smart Cities paper that I finally got to. How can we achieve the goals of smart cities if we all don't speak, or if we're all speaking different languages? It's pretty much my research question, my focus, right? If we really want to achieve the objectives of smart cities, and we really want to make a difference, the world is going to be better once we have smart cities. Well, the best thing that we can do is we need to make sure that we're all on the same page. And immediately, that's the type of paper. Again, I'll tell you, editors are receiving literature reviews since COVID by the tons. And so how do you set yourself apart from another person that has gone and, entered Scopus or Web of Science and has put in a search term and has written a paper on Bitcoin? I don't know. Right. So how are you making your paper different? And often thinking about different stakeholders and the importance of having each one having a voice and that unison, that's very important. Very few times in these papers, in these literature review papers, do we talk about that idea of great literature and introducing practitioner voice into these papers, right? Is what we're researching really valuable for practitioners? And maybe a good way to do that is if we see what they're talking about and trying to see what those topics are, and then seeing how can we integrate those topics into our academic research. Now, I don't know if you remember, but I very specifically, deliberately, I said this is step number 1. And I lied. This is not step number 1. It starts here, but when you're writing a literature review, you don't start off by saying, I'm going to write a literature review on this one very specific thing. It's not possible, right? You need to go through pretty much all the steps, probably until step 6, right? When you synthesize it, when you've analyzed it. And then you say, this literature review is about this, right? This is where the conflict is at. Understanding the conflict at the beginning is almost impossible. To know that there's 2 streams of authors talking about it in 2 different ways. You have to be completely across the literature to know that of this. So even though we talk about this being step number 1, no, it isn't. So often we go and review or do this as a final stage. We have an idea that we want to do a literature review, that's fine. But it's not really, something that we write and forget and that's it. As I was saying to you earlier, most reviewers concentrate on this idea of what is the purpose, what is the motivation. And here are two examples, right? They're anonymous, right? The paper needs to better answer the question, why do we need another literature review on X? There are already a number of literature reviews done in the past year on X. Why do we need another? What does this manuscript do differently? Another comment would be, this research questions aim to uncover dominant trends. No, sorry. The first research question aims to uncover dominant trends, while the second research question aims to uncover current trends. To me, the distinction between these trends is not clear. So having clear research questions, having a clear focus, understanding what has been done in the past and what is your contribution is key to a literature review. Then we go to the thing that comes easiest to us, right? Which is kind of like getting that data. And this is, again, the foundation of a comprehensive and rigorous review. So when we come to step 2, it's about identifying our relevant databases, those that contain high-quality peer-reviewed studies that are relevant for our scope and the research questions that we have. If you look at a lot of the papers that I have published, I often use one database, and that's Scopus. Often people use Scopus and Web of Science or a number of other databases. I shy away from Google Scholar. The reason why I shy away from Google Scholar is because I do not know why Google Scholar at one point decides to no longer think about my query. You know, I might have put something there about, say, for example, digital transformation. On like page 7, I look at a paper and I'm like, does this paper even have the term digital transformation? And it doesn't. So I don't think it's systematic enough at this point. Also, I am aware that the Google homepage, YouTube, and other search engines, when you enter something, when you're searching for something, it will show me different results than, say, for example, it will show Professor Irene. So knowing this, I'm not 100% sure that Google Scholar is going to allow me to be transparent and allow this to be replicable. So I shy away from it. I only use Scopus for one very, very specific reason. It has about 80% of the coverage of journals that I'm truly interested in. So yes, of course, I can find more papers if I also use Web of Science. But if I'm already covering 80%, if my, say, for example, if my sample is already about 200 papers, it may not be needed. I do not complain as a reviewer. I do not complain that the person has used one source. So then we talk about search terms, and search terms is a very interesting area, right? You want to construct, of course, a comprehensive set of keywords and phrases and booleans to capture the papers that you're interested in. When I'm looking and trying to build the search terms, I try to rely on previous well-established literature reviews. Normally, you know, if I'm looking at mixing two topics together, then I will look for what is what previous literature review has been done on topic B, and what literature reviews have been done in topic A, and then I'm going to look at the keywords, and then I'm going to use as a basis those, if possible. However, it's not possible sometimes because the topic is too new or people haven't previously published literature review, and this is where you come in, of course. And then it becomes a refining of the terms. This normally is something that reviewers will pick on. And it's about trying to get the best balance between capturing all the papers that you could versus including keywords that begin to move you away from the research question that you have. A bit of a dance here. Something that we don't do enough of, and perhaps this is not something for you at this stage, but I think there is the need for more backwards and forwards searches. What often happens is that we find a paper that is super interesting, right? And we say, I want to do a literature review initially on this paper and similar papers. And you may have 3 or 4 or 5 papers that are 100% on what you want. Maybe a good idea is to start off by looking at what the references of these 4 or 5 papers are, and then go and look for them, like go and read them. Do they relate to the topic that I'm interested in? That's the backwards part. The forwards part is to see, well, what papers cite these 4 or 5 papers? And then you begin to amass a number of papers that begin to be relevant to your area of research. I think that there's scope for more of that, especially when the search terms aren't as delineated as we would like for it to be. And then, of course, it's the idea of managing your search records. You can, of course, download your initial papers that you get from Scopus. You can download that as a CSV. I normally use just 3 tools, all from Microsoft, all because my university gives them to me for free. The first one is OneNote, where I write what my search string was, at what time I ran it, what day, why I chose that, how many hits it gave me. I take screenshots as well. So I'm like screenshotting everything just in case at one point I need to redo it. And this happens to me all the time. The biggest scare for me as an author is when the review comes and they said, but did you consider doing this? And I have to go and look at everything again. And I ask myself, did I? Anyway, if I have everything written down and I know that I've, gone through the process, then it's a lot easier for me to show evidence of this. So I try to document like a researcher would, right? What I've been doing, what are some of the decisions, what are some of the settings within the programs, etc. Excel is one of my favorite tools because you can open the file from Scopus and then you can add the fields that you want. So that's it. And then OneDrive is where I put the PDFs. So what's the actionable recommendations? Think about where your data is at, right? Is it going to be, are you just going to look at Web of Science or Scopus or beyond that? What websites? Try to use and learn about Boolean operators to think about that. Okay, let me tell you one more because I just came up with an idea here. And document your search strategy, what keywords, when. And a trick that I do, right, is I will email my collaborators every step, every decision that I've made, and tell them why. And this helps me document. And often I might forget when writing the methodology, say, for example, of the literature review, I might forget something, but because I've not been relying on myself as the only person of the team, often my co-authors say, hey, Mauricio, didn't you do this? And I'm like, yes, I did. And then I can refer back to that email. They help me come back to those ideas. The other thing that I came up with the comprehensive search, it is not a bad idea, though slightly complex, but it is not a bad idea to pass this search string by other academics in your field, in your area, just as a sanity check. Okay, so examples from my research. What have I encountered when it comes to that search string? I recently, we talk about how this is a highly complex, highly debated topic of how do you choose the keywords. This is tough. And often as a reviewer, I'm questioning why a person chose certain keywords. But I reviewed an article, wanted to come up with the best way to determine the best keywords. And I think that there's a need for that, because there's no way right now to determine what is the optimal way of calculating which papers should be included or not. Unfortunately, I don't think that paper was robust enough. So there isn't right now a way to determine what's the best keywords for a literature review. In a paper that I was asked to review, unfortunately I noticed that they had an and where there should be an or. So, I comment on this. Also, when I was reviewing another paper that used Google Scholar to find relevant papers, I tried doing what they had done, and my Google Scholar was saying that there was 18,000 results. They said that they found 166, which made it a little bit difficult. And then there is, the idea of selection of keywords, where I'm asking the reviewers, the authors, is this really the term? Is this really what you mean with the term X? Right? I comment that you cannot tie those two together. That's why I was saying to you before that it is super important that when you have a concept, that you clearly define it. Because if you have a definition, then I cannot make that comment later. I know, okay, so for the authors, this is how they understand this concept, and this is how it's been understood before by other researchers. So when they talk about it in this way, it's fine. The other things that have happened to me is, the idea of avoiding restrictions not based on the research question. So sometimes you might say, this is the next one. You might say, I don't want to include, I don't know. Let me tell you what has happened better. I have had authors that say, well, my paper is not appearing right now on with the search string that we have. So how can we make it appear? So is the introduction of another keyword really going to help you answer the research question, or are we adding keywords because an author's paper is not yet included in the sample? The final thing I've got here from my research is, aim for transparency when you're selecting the journals, the databases, and the time periods, and always present the full search string in your appendix. So then we go to step number 3, which is screening for inclusion. And if you have used multiple databases and you're amalgamating everything together, then you might be thinking about deduplication. So that's when because you have two different or two or more databases that you've used, now when you begin to put them together, there might be duplicate records and you don't want to double count. You want to do an initial screening. Normally this is done by looking at title and abstract and seeing, is this a relevant paper? So what may happen is that the paper just briefly mentions something, but is not the main theme of the paper. And so you might want to get rid of that paper. And so you're doing that at that stage of the initial screening. If you're unsure, you say, that's okay, I'm going to leave it in for now. When I do the full text review, I'm going to be scrutinizing that paper again, so it's fine. And so you're going to do a thorough examination of the study for eligibility at that point. One of the tools for this is Prisma, and I'm going to go and show it to you because I think it's worth showing. This is the Prisma flow diagram. And what I love about it is that you can create, let me see if I expand this a little bit more so it looks better. You can create these type of diagrams that show where you got your sources from. And so we often maybe have seen something like this in papers of literature reviews, and we can say, for example, well, when I ran my query, I had 150 papers on the database. Actually, let's do a little test here. I might have ran this query in multiple databases, so I'm going to report how many papers came from each source. Then I'm going to say, okay, this number was removed because they were duplicates. Let's say 30 were removed because they were duplicates. And you can see it's immediately being reflected in this image. I didn't use an automation tool, and I'm going to say that none others were deleted because of other reasons. So at that point, let's just imagine for a second that I have 120 papers, and during my screening, I screened 120 papers, and that I excluded, because I looked at their abstract, I excluded, normally it's something like 60. Let's just imagine for a second. And then I looked for 60, and let me just delete this for simplicity. I say that I looked at 60, and that for reasons X, Y, and Z, I then reduced it to, say, for example, 30 studies. Right? Once you've done that, you can just download it and include it in your paper. It's a really nice way of showing how you got here. And the beauty about this is that it aligns perfectly with the systematic ways of doing a literature, and very specifically this stage here of the initial screening, and a little bit beyond into what were some of the eligible papers that made it into your literature review. So the initial screening, again, from the abstract and so on, you want to eliminate it if the paper doesn't help answer your research question. So what are some of the reasons why you exclude a paper initially in the abstract screening, or maybe the full paper screening? You can think of, it's not an empirical work. You just want to concentrate on empirical works only. It's a different study population. Maybe you're just looking at a region, like maybe you're just looking at online education in Africa, and you say, for example, you've got papers that have America or Australia, you might want to remove those. Of course, a classical one is language and accessibility. Often, authors eliminate papers based on publication types, like, oh, we don't want to look at conferences, or we don't want to look at other review articles. my recommendation on this one is that you actually exclude it in your search string. Don't wait to get those papers and then be like, I really didn't want that paper. And often also authors talk about lack of quality. And that's where you have journal lists that have quality listed in them. And we talk about this a little bit more in the next stage, but in the initial screening, in some cases, some authors say we retrieve all papers and then we remove those papers that were not in the ABDC or the ABS journal list. So the actionable recommendations for stage 3 are consistently make sure that you're applying your criteria. Often it's a good idea to have multiple reviewers look at this to reduce bias and ensure consistency, and removing duplicates. Think about both a tool like Excel to help you automate the detection, but also make sure that before you delete anything, you manually check to make sure that you're not deleting or excluding papers by mistake. So examples from my research, what have I learned? Duplication can take various forms. Duplicates are not always that a paper is named the same 2 times. It can be that the authors have published multiple times with the same data set. That can be a reason for exclusion, right? You don't want to count the same data set 2 times, and it's a completely valid way. The other thing is, do not trust Scopus. Scopus, I would say, is about 90 to 95% correct. So one of the ways that I do is I sort by name and I try to see if there's any 2 similar names, and then I try to delete those manually if I see that the names of the same paper, the title of the same publication is there listed there twice. I also look for duplicates using the DOIs. Then we get to step 4. Which is something that is very rarely mentioned, the idea of assessing quality. From the paper from Templier and Paré, they talk about tools that help recognize quality. What I have normally seen much more often is that this step is just by saying, we look at the top 10 journals of accounting, according to, say, for example, Google Scholar, or we look at these top 10 journals because we know that the conversation of this is most likely to be found here, or we use the ABS journal list, something like that. The idea of individually checking each paper then for quality is something that I have very, very, very seldomly seen. It is not something mentioned in the Prisma statement, and it is only briefly mentioned in the paper from Aguinis et al. So if you have seen this before of quality, I'd say if you want to follow that, the best bit is just to use ABS and ABDC as a proxy for quality. When looking at great literature, there may be no quality list, and you might say, well, I'm going to rely on practitioner publications from these 10 high quality outlets, and that's good. Rather than looking at everything, I'm going to look at these government websites, which is good, you can. And I'm going to look at, say, for example, these newspapers, which are high quality, given the readership, for example. Stage 5 out of 6, by the way. Then we get into the data extraction. And this is one of those areas that I know that I will get many more questions than the ones that I've gotten. And we talk about, extracting the relevant information from the papers that we've now distilled. So at this point, we've looked at all those papers. We said, okay, these papers are the ones that I'm going to keep. You've looked at their abstracts. You've done a full reading of the manuscripts. You've kept them inside. Now it's time to start extracting some data from them. And at this point, you want to extract key details, and I'm going to give you, examples of those key details, such as methods, analytical approaches, key findings. You want to extract all of that. You want to extract all of that and put it in a coding framework, right? This is Excel. And then you want to make sure that you have coding consistency. If you can, right, and this can be free, by the way, you can ask a colleague, a friend, another person doing a PhD to help you code papers. And you can do the same on their side so that you have multiple researchers. And you want to verify the consistency, the reliability of your coding framework. The funny bit of extracting the relevant information is what is relevant. And you can only know what is relevant only once you've actually finished and you see what the storyline of your paper is. Of all the extracted data from a literature review, I would say that only around 10% of the data really makes it into the paper. So you might say, for example, here's some ideas of things that you want to collect. You might say, okay, what is from a paper? From each paper, you might want to have something like this, right? What is the objectives? What are the hypotheses? You might want to say, well, what theory are they using? What assumptions do they have? With regards to their methodology, you might be asking about the research design. What are their data collection methods? What are the samples? What are the characteristics, right? Where was the sample gotten? That's location. What jurisdiction? What organizational setting, right? Is it at the individual level? Is it at the organizational level? You might want to look and extract then the main findings. You might want to extract the theoretical contribution, the practical contribution, the policy recommendations. You might want to identify any biases, any gaps, any limitations. And you might want to get from every paper the future research. This is what I call the starting point, right? This doesn't mean that this is at all comprehensive. This is the starting point of pretty much every literature review. Depending on your research questions, you might want to say, well, in the paper, do they define the topic of your literature review? In other words, if your literature review, let's just imagine for a second, it's on artificial intelligence. Do they define the term artificial intelligence? How is X conceptualized in the paper? If you're looking at two topics, how is the interaction between X and Y conceptualized in the paper? Now, let me give you another example. Let's say that we wanted to look at a paper where we had enablers and detractors from the adoption of new accounting technology, right? What we could do is we could have columns, right? We could have a column that says technological factor enabler, technological factor detractor, organizational factor enabler, organizational factors detractors, and so on, right? We could look at environmental factors and individual factors, and for each of these have a split. And ultimately, you might end up with something like this, right? Where after you've reviewed all your papers, right, you might have a first order item like technological factors, a second order item like compatibility or something like that, and then a description. And so you might then end up saying like something like technology fits well with existing accounting systems is a enabler, right? And then you list here your references of papers that have mentioned this, right? And say, for example, when it comes to organizational factors, there might be management support. This is your second order item. And then you might think of strong leadership that helps support the adoption of this. Then you might say something like environmental factors, regulatory incentives are, say, for example, grants that are also enabling the adoption of new technology. And so you end up with a list of factors that come from your literature review. And while many papers have just been focusing on here, this description bit, what you're doing is you're elevating your paper and actually giving it a contribution, giving it a good contribution, right? That's where the magic sauce is. So how do you ensure coding consistency? You can have multiple coders. This multiple coders helps mitigate individual biases. You document every step of the way. And initially, you wish to reach consensus by discussing anything that may be ambiguous in the coding process with your coders. But let me tell you now, what are some of the examples from my research? So I've spoken to you about this work on AI in the workplace. At the beginning, we as authors read about 10 to 20 papers. We determined what was to be extracted. So what are some of these categories? We created the spreadsheet, the framework, in other words. And then we extracted the paper. We extracted the information and then said, well, you know, when we were not agreeing on it, we said, wait, is that the right title for that category? We clarified that, we clarified what we meant. We maybe changed the name of it. Then we went on to recruit, depending, because we've had to do it twice, anywhere between 6 to 10 coders. We give them 2 to 3 articles each. Then we discuss as a group, right? This is very basic at this point. We're not asking them to, you know, this is not going to be used for anything. This is just kind of like a creating that grounding needed. And then once we've had a discussion, once we reach an agreement, we then give them 10 articles and ask them to extract data from that. And then in that point, we're going to calculate the inter-rater reliability. We use Krippendorff's alpha, and if it's above 0.8, then that means that we have excellent agreement, and we, provide this coder with new papers. If in the case that we do not reach that Krippendorff's alpha of 0.8, then we do another cycle of another 10 papers being reviewed by this one coder, and we again calculate Krippendorff's alpha, and we hope that by then we have reached a sort of an agreement between our coders, and that if we were to give this instructions to any new coders, this process would be replicable, that they would achieve pretty much the same outputs as we did. We reach pretty much the final stage 6. And as I was saying, kind of like this stage, there's not much that is being said, right? And the reason why there's not a very prescriptive explanation of how do you do the analysis and synthesis of data is because there's many literature review types and there's many research questions, which makes recommendations in this section a little bit complex. The only recommendation that I have here is read. How has this been done before? But, generally, here's some recommendations. Create a unified picture. For narrative and developmental reviews, using verbal descriptions is fine, but for more cumulative or aggregative reviews, you're using more of that quantitative data. And rigorous documentation is required for cumulative and aggregative reviews to ensure then reproducibility. Have clearly demonstrate how you achieve the outcomes from the analysis and the synthesis. One of my favorite ways is to employ guiding theories, competing models, or grounded theory, then to propose a coherent structuring of evidence. The simplest way is, say, for example, when it comes to adoption, you can think of any framework, any theory that helps you then put papers into certain categories. So say, for example, think of TOE framework. TOE stands for Technology, Organization, and Environment. And so if you can say, well, here are the papers that are more talking about technology, here's the papers that are more talking about the environment, here's more talking about the organization, that's a good way of splitting and then discussing your papers together. I often like the theme sub-theme idea. I do not like the author-centric approach. So those reviews that go May 2022 talked about this, Guthrie 2027 talked about that. That's a paper in a sentence. That's not what we're here for. I'd say if you say, multiple authors have previously spoken about accounting and integrated reporting, and then talk about what the contribution of each paper is, not the author. That's much more beneficial. And then the unspoken gem of a paper is the future research path. And you can, of course, organize them by topic in the same way that I've just told you. And this is where it just takes a little bit more time to come up with these future research paths, but it also just comes from reading where the literature is going. And sometimes, say, for example, if I'm looking at technology factors, I might read other papers on other literature reviews on technology factors and try to gain an idea or a deeper understanding of what these technology factors are, or what other authors are recommending for future paths of researchers, and then integrate them to some of my ideas on future research paths when doing my literature review. So, unfortunately, examples from my research is that there's no one size fits all. It will depend on the type, on the research questions, and on the data gathered and what your narrative will be. I think when it comes to visualizations, I'm not 100%. I mean, you want to have a visualization, you want to try to come up with a model, that's all good. I am a little bit not sure about bibliometric tools at this point. I know that the paper that I've published on uses bibliometric tools. I don't think it's the only way of creating results. I think it's a fantastic way of creating reliability of your study. So say, for example, if you say, we first did a bibliometric analysis, and then we ran a normal literature review, a systematic literature review, and then we tried to put these two together, the results of those two together. I think that's a fabulous work, because as a reviewer, what you're doing is you're reducing the biases in this case, right? So it helps me trust your findings a little bit more, to see that you've done this in two different ways. The reason why I'm not 100% sold on bibliometric tools at this point is because when I read literature reviews using bibliometric analysis tools, they are extremely shallow. So what they will do is they will talk about the number of papers published, from what country the authors are. They will talk about what journals these publications are coming from, and I don't think that adds value. And they finish their discussion there, and nothing else is said. And yeah, there's not enough there for a publication in a top journal. So if you use it to complement your analysis, it's fabulous. I think it's a very good way of doing it. Don't just stop at that point of saying, oh, look, here's a nice little graph of citations, or here's a nice little map of the keywords being used, because we cannot use that further. So my key takeaways, I've provided you with key insights, actionable recommendations to then try to enhance the transparency, the rigor, and the overall usefulness of literature reviews. And I think that there's scope for a couple of things. I think that there's the need to have more diverse review types. And I think that there's also the opportunity to leverage more novel approaches, such as meta-analysis and umbrella reviews going forward. So those are my details. I will look at the questions now. Thank you so much for sticking with me.
Thank you so much, Professor Meron, for the wonderful presentation. It was indeed a good presentation. I'll go to the Q&A session. You put your hand up. I think we shall first take 3 questions and then take another set. Thank you. I hope we know where we go to raise our hands.
Let me start off with a question from Joseph here. After analyzing the literature review of a particular topic, I realized that my topic has already been done by most researchers, and it's difficult to reveal a gap. In this case, what can we do? I think in this case, and it's hard, right? I don't know what the topic is, right? What we are thinking about is there's a possibility of doing something like an umbrella analysis or review. There is the possibility of finding that conflict, that dispute, that theoretical puzzle. If you're not able to do that, then perhaps there's not a need for a review. Often the story comes only once you've extracted the data from the papers. Only then can you say, wait a second, I have found conflict, or I have a new theoretical contribution to be made. But yeah, that was my answer. So I look forward to more questions. Oh, yes. I've got another question here from Prince. Is there a distinction between systematic literature review and structured literature review? Great question. And, I've had this question before. I separate the reviews. The term is used interchangeably. So I'd still separate and think that systematic is much more robust than structured. If I was going to use a term, I would use systematic and not structured. And yes, I'll share my presentation. It's not a problem at all. I've got another one. If I am asked about my contribution, how do I bring it out? Oof. That's a tough one. Okay. So maybe the idea might be to maybe the question here is, how do I develop insight? I can think of two ways, there's more, to develop insight. One idea is to relate it to theoretical frameworks, right? So we link our findings to existing theories. We assess whether current theories explain the findings from our review, or if there's a need for new theoretical developments. The other way is to contextualize the research. So think about where the research has taken place, what type of population, what time period, and discuss how these factors might influence your results. How are two, if we said, well, look, there's not enough research, say, for example, of this in Africa, then I think you are creating the gap. And then you say, well, here's my contribution. My contribution is that there's been a lot of research, say, for example, in other continents, but just not enough in Africa. What are some of the implications of that for the African context? I believe that there is an African journal where, this type of literature review, where you perhaps focus on the geographical aspect of what research has been done, that might be appealing to them, because what it may do is it may encourage other researchers to then follow those paths that you would outline in your literature review. And I'd say that as you explore the contextual differences, you could look at how outcomes are different. Say, for example, you might say that a variable has a positive effect when it's studied in Europe, but a negative effect when it's studied in Asia. So that's what I'm thinking about the contribution. Aha. I got a good question here from Lucas. How long may it take on average for a single author to write a quality literature review? I love that question. Okay. I can tell you a story of a paper that I wrote in 2020. We started probably before COVID, right? Probably February, before COVID in Australia, right? And that paper that we have written has not yet been published. Funnily enough, we submitted that paper, right, to a couple of journals. It got rejected from both of them. And then it went to a third one where they said, we love it, but can you change it completely? We want a completely new sample, and we want you to do exactly what you did, but in a new sample. So we said, okay, we're going to save this paper that we've done, and we're going to write this new paper here. That paper got published. This paper still hasn't gotten published, and it's been 4 years. It depends on what your target is. If you're going for an A, I'm thinking about a minimum of 2 years.
Asante. Acha
Can you
tutu
mix
guys.
qualitative and quantitative?
Alinipa dawa
Yes.
lakini same
You
day
can.
inatoka hapa. Nimefika ofisini. Damu itaanza
Just
kutoka
apologies. Hold on.
yenyewe
Where
bila
is-
dawa.
where
Kwa
is
hiyo
it?
mi nikaacha kutumia ile dawa.
I can just mute everyone and then I'll release you back. You can unmute yourself now, please.
Very good. So yes, you can, and I think that's called a mixed method. So if we go back to, say, for example, let's see if I can quickly do it. Let me exit here, and let me see if I show you this. When I talk about the different styles, there is a mixed methods. Here we go. Percent. And let me share my screen now. And if we look at this, there are mixed method reviews, mixed method synthesis. So there is definitely scope for this. And exactly something like this, right? Where you say that where you're doing two things at the same time, right? So you're going to have a contribution of a methodological contribution and say, we understand that there are a number of literature review styles or types, sorry, that are often used in management and accounting, and that there has been calls from researchers to say that we need a varied review type in our review. So my first contribution is going to be the usage of a mixed method synthesis for this type of work. I think that's your first contribution. I think it's going to be very good. Then you have the contribution of the literature review yourself. So if you look at, say, for example, some of the some of the papers that I've written, we also have this idea of the double contribution. And like the contribution number one is often the machine learning contribution. So we say, oh, we use machine learning for literature reviews, and we do the literature review as well. So that's, contributing already to making the paper more attractive, if I can say that. Any other questions, please?
There was a question from Dennis Soula.
Oh, yes, I'm reading. Look at that. Can methodological review be considered as part of a critical review? Let me see if I understand this question. So you're reviewing a methodology, and then you're using the critical review that we talked about as one type. Yes, I don't see why not. You could do that for a theory, for a topic, for a methodology. So yes.
There was also one from Dennis Soula, elaborates
Oh, yeah.
on the review question on smart cities.
Okay, does language difference become the research problem, or how to achieve? Okay, very good, Dennis. Thank you so much for that question. No, the language difference becomes the research problems, right? So in that paper, we say that there are many benefits. So we say, we want to, if people want to achieve the benefits of smart cities, we need to all be in the same page. And to be on the same page, we need to understand if there's any differences in the way that the four stakeholders are talking about that one single topic.
Thank you. We can take another set of questions, maybe one or two, then I'll call Yinka to close. One or two more questions. If there are no more questions, Yinka, you're welcome. There is one more question.
Okay,
Uh,
take that one
what
still.
has
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, how do we know what what is a time period? I believe I'm gonna assume that that's the question. The easiest way that often people say is to say that the term first appeared in the publication of 1988, right? And then you say, well, our search string is from 1988 onwards. I do not particularly subscribe to that unless the term was used erroneously before 1988, for example. Then, of course, you want to have that 1988 and beyond, and then it should reduce the false positives. Otherwise, why have the period being set, right? If you're not getting hits before 1988, why have a time period? Not having the time period as well shows the opportunity for you to engage or to understand if there has been any usage before what you thought was that paper. So in other words, if you didn't come across or you hadn't read those other papers that talk about this one term before, you have the opportunity to learn about them. So period is only for when you're going to get false positives before that time. And to everybody that has been giving me positive feedback, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Hopefully I get invited again. Thank you.
Absolutely, Mauricio. I mean, we will surely get you. I want to thank you especially because this is typically a methodology lecture as usual as we'll have them. So I can see the depth and the patience with which you have really addressed the issues, and I genuinely want to thank you for your time and your contribution. I think your contact is there and different ways to reach you. So most of the things you've just said here, people will gradually digest them. So don't be surprised when you get those random emails. Perhaps some of them, if you've got time, you can just respond to, or you can always continue to provide them with resources that will help them build further on the things you've just done. Thank you so much. Just in closing, everyone, I just want to sort of once more thank you for joining. If you don't know me, I'm Yinka Moses, and I am the Vice President of the African Accounting and Finance Association. I hope my screen is sharing properly, the events, yes. So once more, as we close, I thought it was good. I just give a bit of a reminder that this was a well-registered event, but like I said, Mauricio, we get about 100 plus, like it's a lot of people for time clashes, different time zone, they'll go back and watch it, but we had over 288 registered participants. You would have noticed from how rapidly people were following you. We had about close to 45% of the people who registered as doctoral students and about 27% as much younger academics coming up in that profession. So it's good to see that enthusiasm to learn. So I expect this will build up. And in terms of the country, we had quite a few countries in attendance. So big shout outs to all the people from Uganda who made the most proportion. And I think there is purely a positive development in that region because this is an Eastern region event. And thank you, Irene, Stephen, and all the people from that region that pushed. Can see good numbers from Nigeria as well. Kenya, Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the UK. So It's been a pleasure, including New Zealand, where we've got a few people joining. So once more, I'm just kind of reiterating, and we had almost 67% of the attendees today as first timers, so which is good for us. As an association, it's always good to get people who don't know much about what we do come along. So I'm just wrapping up to just give people a sense of this data. And once more, Stephen mentioned the AAFA conference, which is coming up in Zimbabwe. If it's something that is of interest to you, you can just go to the AAFA website. I'll put the link shortly. And then you will find more information about, what to do, how to register, and how to sort of participate in the conference. But as for today, this is the place where we bring it to an end. And I just want to thank Mauricio once more. Hopefully we're going to get you to do more things. Yeah, we'll think about other things we can do together. But this has been helpful. And thank you, everyone. It's bye-bye from me.
Yeah, bye-bye,
you, everybody.
Uncle Yinka.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
cheers, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.